hey, this is going to be my training shoe, and then I'm going to spend a lot of other times in like racing shoes. Maybe not. Maybe something like the Nova Blast might work. If you have the funds, go for it. I would say that. Or the other option of where I can see this working if you have the funds is if you're getting used, you're not ready for, or you haven't really spent a lot of time in these super shoes yet, in the like played like the Metaspeed Sky or Edge. I think this would be a good way to kind of go, you know what? I'm going to spend some money on this. It's not $250, it's $220. Let's take this through a training cycle and see how I respond. And, you know, maybe we should wait on that comment. I'm going to save that actually. So speaking of which, let's talk about these. So let's isolate this to the Super Max trainers. So what do you think the purpose of these overly stack-heighted, super foam, sometimes stiffened, or what's always stiff, but sometimes plated shoes, what do you think their purpose is?
I think it's a question that's dependent on the goal of the company, right? Like, I mean, based on the three that we talked about, like the Prime X is designed to go fast. It's on the Adizero line. You know, like they're not going to put it lightly in that line.
Yeah.
If you see Adizero, that's a performance shoe. With the Super Blast, they wanted it to be like that Swiss Army knife.
Yeah.
At least based on everything I saw them with their tech sheets, their marketing, like what they were saying, like that's what they wanted out of the shoe. The SE Trainer, they kind of wanted that high stack, comfortable shoe. I never really saw them market it as like, go chase your PR in this shoe.
No.
So I think it's just it's a question that's hard to answer because it really just comes down to the goal of the actual piece of footwear, not necessarily the category itself.
Right. And so that's important distinction to be made is, again, we can categorize things, but it doesn't mean they're similar. They might have very, very different purposes. Still, though, is there any kind of thing that you might see that connects them? And the answer might be no, in terms of like the design, in terms of the high stack height, the rocker geometry, the super foam in this tall of a stack. Is there anything that makes them similar in that regard in terms of their purpose?
Yeah, I mean, really using the new generation materials, you know, when it comes to vibration, loading on the joints, being able to just make things a little bit more economically efficient in most cases. Being able to just take that pressure off of the runner and allow them to recover and come back the next day a little bit better than they may have been. I think that ultimately is the goal of this new generation of midsoles, whether it's the racing shoes or these super trainers. And I know anecdotally I've used them for that. I've used the Super Blast for that. I've used the, I almost said Endorphin, the Tempest for that, but I have used the Endorphin Speed 3. I've used it for that purpose. You know, I've used the Tempest for that purpose. I'm looking around here. I've used almost every shoe that I got to my left here for recovery purposes at some point. You know, it's not always for driving performance.
Right.
So I think just easing the strain on your body with the daylight savings and with it being dark early. Now the sun's rising at a decent time, but when it's real dark, I run on roads a lot more than I would. And usually I run in multi-surface a lot, and when it's dark, I'm not even going to chance it, especially in the fall, because it's racing season. So I'll be very boring. I will run in a straight line down on a road for 5 miles, and I'll turn around and I'll come back, and it's a 10-mile out and back, and I'm just running on road. And when I'm doing those days, you know, like the road traditionally can beat you up a little bit. And so I think these shoes are another shoes that I kind of reach for, where it's like, oh, I don't have to worry about it as much as far as the recovery piece goes.
So again, for recovery purposes or training purposes, when you don't want to beat yourself up as much, that's where, and on road specifically, that's where these shoes would be beneficial for those who are interested going, yeah, if you want to save your legs a little bit more, have a little bit more cush underneath there, you know, so some of them may be able to handle workouts and maybe you save your legs a little bit more on those workouts. Whereas the SC Trainer is going to be, that's saving your legs for recovery days. Is there anybody that you think should be cautious or avoid these shoes?
Yeah, well, anyone who has a neuropathy problem.
Yeah.
With that said, I mean, there are some runners that have neuropathy problems though. Like they are definitely out there, but anyone who has a hard time with like knowing where your feet are, you're not the most nimble, maybe you're a little bit clumsy and you kind of clip your feet, you roll your ankles, you're just not quite as efficient. That's not even a good word. I don't like that word, because it's like some people just maybe their legs swing out a little bit more and they just hit things. They move things like they're not as smooth as other runners are. I think those are people that probably shouldn't be playing around with these super soft compliant foams, especially if it's over 40 millimeters of stack. It's already over regulation. So let's say you're struggling in a Vaporfly. Chances are you're going to be struggling even more in something that's higher up. The other group, because these foams are more compliant and responsive, people that like to push the Easy Days, and if they know it,
it's great.
Yeah, you probably shouldn't put these on because these foams are more resilient. They bounce back. You have good energy return. If you don't know how to keep yourself in check, then like these don't help that situation at all.
Yeah, it can make it worse. I think Primex for sure. So I definitely agree with you on those two populations. From, a healthy standpoint, runners who don't know how to control pace, this is not going to help you. You're going to start pushing the pace more, and just because they might help you with shock absorption in certain areas, we don't know what these do mechanically to people. We have an idea of what some of the super shoes do because that's where all the research is, but we don't know if people's mechanics are changing with the additional stack height, the combined extra foam. We have nothing. We got zip on this. Although we do know that when you start increasing the stack height more, that increases the lever arm of the limb. So oftentimes you might kind of start putting a little extra load into some of the structures like hamstring, some of the more proximal stuff. So that's not for sure, but there might be some changes in risk factors. And if you can't control yourself, these shoes aren't going to make you invincible. You're still going to have risk factors. So I think that's a really important one to go. If you don't have self-control with the pace, these are probably not good options. The other population, I totally agree with you, is if you have proprioception or body sense issues. If you have kind of more advanced neuropathies where you really can't feel where your foot is. I understand from a protection point, right? The diabetic foot or that kind of stuff. We've seen great stuff in the literature with rockered soles and a little more cushioning. But if you're the kind of person that doesn't have a good idea of where your feet are and you risk tripping over something, these shoes extend you far enough off the ground that you're going to have a hard time figuring out where your foot is. And that's really important, not only for landing, but also for the swing phase when you're picking stuff up. So I could see these being a hazard. But if those issues aren't around, you might be fine. So and speaking of which, so there's some great stuff. There's some stuff maybe people need to aware of. What do you think is being done really well with these three, with where things are going?
Yeah, I like the direction. I think with anything, as you have an increase in innovation, you're going to start using what you're creating. I mean, you put so much hours into creating these new foams, you might as well use them. Why reserve them for only one or two shoes? And I think it's been a progression of the times. I mean, for a long time it was EVA, right? And they still exist, and I think there's still a place for it. It keeps the price point down, and it keeps the weight down in some regards, unless you're using really expensive materials. But you saw it with the progression from EVA to TPU. So then Adidas started using a lot of boost materials. You saw Reebok with their Float Ride Energy. A lot of people are using expanded TPEs, things like that, where it's kind of like maybe they're putting a little bit of gas or they're aerating the foams. And then they start incorporating that in their daily shoes. And then they have another foam lined up for their racing shoes. And so I think it's also a little bit of a direction of the industry as well when you're taking a look at what they're deciding to put in, because if they're putting these new generation midsoles in the training shoe and they're starting to put it in more and more shoes, it starts to make me think that they might have something else lined up further down the line, that they're like, okay, so like now this is going to become our base and now we're going to build off of this as well. Because even though like Nike has Zoom X, but they're working on other things.
Right.
Everyone is. Like, that's no secret. Everyone's trying to make their product better. And so I think it's also a certain sense of comfort. And I think as like PBA and PBAX becomes more accessible from actual manufacturing and product standpoint, that can also keep the price down. And then eventually maybe replace EVA. I don't know if it will ever go to the point where it replaces it, but it can get that price point to where it's more manageable for the consumer. And now you're going to have a shoe that is pretty well on the performance scale, and it has a compliant, resilient foam, and it doesn't break the bank. And you have some companies that are kind of doing it. Like, how much is the Rebel? The Rebel isn't like killer,
That's a
is
good
it?
question.
Like
I don't remember.
130, 120?
It was more affordable than I expected it to be. Let me look that up.
Yeah. And then you've got some companies that they're sliding pieces of it. So like the Audio,
140
is like 120. Yeah. So like you
Rebels
got some
140.
shoes that are pretty comparable with other pieces of the market that are using some of these materials, you know?
Right.
So maybe they don't have a plate, maybe they don't have a more intense geometry, but they're still solid shoes in and of themselves, you know? So I think it's interesting. I think it's more just the direction of the industry itself.
And I think that makes sense that what we're seeing with all the research and development that's going into racing shoes, that they would obviously take some of that and start putting it in other shoes. So I think these Super Max, Super Trainers, and some of the other more normal stack, Super Trainers where you're seeing these films, I think it's a natural progression. It makes sense. It makes sense that people would go, hey, with these Super Max, how much stack height can we put in here? And I think that there might be some diminishing returns as you start getting higher and higher and higher, because then you inevitably have issues with weight and size, and some of the geometry just isn't going to work, right? Once you're on stilts at that point. But I do think what's being done well is that the companies are specifying what these are for. And it's not where you're like, hey, we're just going to throw this out here and let people do what you want with it, which kind of happened with some of the racing shoes, like the Vaporfly and Alphafly. People were like, advertised like you can just be a new runner and just go jog in those. And I was like, I still have my hesitation about that, but it's nice to now see they've gone, you know what? Now we have something that you can go train in. And they've been specific. Other people, Adidas didn't say that the Prime X was a trainer. They said this is a racing shoe. This is a faster shoe for workouts where you want more protection. Asics was great about saying we want the Super Blast is a versatile, like a tempo, long run, like kind of do it all shoe. And then New Balance was marketing the SC Trainer as that recovery shoe that like we want to take some of the stuff our athletes want to train in the SC Elite or the V3 or the RC Elite 2, but we said don't do that. Here's this other option so you can get some of these, responsiveness benefits in a shoe meant for daily training. So I like that they're being specific with what the purpose is while being able to mesh some of the benefits that we've seen from the racing shoes while still making it available to train in. Is there anything you think needs to be improved? Anything you're like, this has to be better? Come on.
To some degree, I think it comes with certain companies and how they're approaching it, because when you take a look at the properties of the actual foam, PEBA being, like polyethyl block amide,
yes,
like the chemical thermoplastic that it is that you create a foam of, very compliant, very resilient, but with that said, compliant being soft, bouncy, it's a different foam. And if you have it on a narrow platform and it has that rocker geometry, or it's got something a little more aggressive like the Prime X, that is not going to work for a lot of people.
Right.
And maybe they're not making a shoe for a lot of people. Maybe they want it to be a niche thing, but I think the direction of the category, if you want it to be a consumer-friendly shoe overall, if you just widen it out a little bit, whether it's the platform or a little bit of sole flaring, or you just integrate some sidewalls a little bit better, like there's some things you can do to just make that shoe a more streamlined shoe and just make it more comfortable. And I think it's one of the things that Saucony did pretty well when they took a look at the Endorphin Pro 3. Now that's the racing category, but they were like, okay, well, we have a PBX shoe. How can we make this a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more stable for the consumer, and make it a more enjoyable experience while still having that resilient foam? It doesn't have to be this super streamlined, narrow shoe that like only people that are going to be transitioning quick through that midfoot and forefoot, are going to enjoy. So what people are doing with the racing shoes, because we're seeing that more and more, it's not just Saucony, it's other companies too, applying that more with the usage of the materials and applying that to the training shoes as well. Like just being cognizant of the materials that you're actually using and then making a package that is actually suitable for the consumer you're marketing for.
Yeah. I think that's really good, where I would totally agree with Prime X. We don't know exactly who this is being marketed, if it's just that niche shoe going, hey, we're going to do something crazy. But yeah, it's very niche. There's going to be a very specific population that's going to be able to handle this. Whereas I think the SC Trainer and the Super Blast, are going to be able to handle more people. I think that was done better. I think the SC Trainer, they did a fairly good job at trying to keep it, in like not making it super unstable, despite the amount of fuel cell, the plate design, and kind of the guideline throughout here did a decent job. You just got to be careful, because with these super soft shoes, right, it might lock the ankle in well, but you're still going to have the instability that's going to hit the hip. I think the Super Blast did that better, where because it's just a little more on the firm end for a shoe like this, but it's still got a lot of resilience and compliance in the sole where it really will bounce you back, did it better. My only challenge is, even though this doesn't have a plate, this actually feels the stiffest of the three of them. And so I think that you got, again, when you design a shoe like this, if you want it to be a long run, you got to really be careful with that toe off, because that's, for me, it was so stiff. I was getting like, and in the review I talked about, I was getting some like knee aching because I was having to compensate to get my foot off this shoe. So I think you have to be very careful with the geometry. If you're going to make it for the general public, you have to be careful with how aggressive it is. And that's really hard. It's hard to make a shoe for everyone. So that's why you got to make sure that you're being very careful with who you market to and what it's really meant for. So it's not necessarily criticism saying they're doing it bad. You just got to be really careful in this category, because it's honestly going to be something that more people might be willing to put on their feet, because it's going to be less aggressive than something like Vaporfly or RC Elite 2, which we are, at least anecdotally, I am seeing that some of these shoes, people are going, oh, these are sexy, but it's not decreasing injury risk. In fact, it's actually enabling people to kind of push themselves into the red zone when they maybe shouldn't be there all the time. So the people who are training in the RC Elite 2 or training in the Vaporfly may not be the best option, whereas this is going to be, I think, a shoe that's more accessible to those people. They still need to be a little careful, because, again, the consumer is going to be a lot more varied than somebody who's going to pick a Vaporfly. But that's just kind of a word of caution. I think overall they're doing a pretty good job.